All right, we've talked about the three jewels, the three refuges. I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, I take refuge in the Sangha. And we've talked about the Buddha, albeit briefly, and we've talked about the Dharma, unpacked his Four Noble Truths. Now we want to talk about the Sangha, the community of Buddhist disciples. I'm going to have to move this, maybe here, okay? The Buddha gathered a large and diverse community, including monks, nuns, and lay supporters. And this is one example of a congregation of Buddhist monks. Lay people. The ideal image of a lay supporter was Anathapindika. He was a generous early supporter of the Buddha. Here we see him honoring the Buddha. And he was especially generous. He bought the deer park that housed the Buddha and his immediate followers. There are four major Buddhist pilgrimage places. The first is Lumbini, that place where Buddha was born. You saw some of that in the movie. The second is Bodh Gaya, where he achieved enlightenment. The third is Sarnath. Sarnath is where he gathered, following his enlightenment, he gathered a community of believers. And this is the deer park given by Anathapindika. Generosity is not one of the five key moral precepts for lay people, but it's a very fundamental Buddhist virtue, and it's a way for lay people to support Buddhism and to practice renunciation. So monks, typical monks in, for example, Sri Lanka will rise very early. They will have shaved heads, they will wear saffron robes, and carry begging bowls. Here's some monks in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has a very harsh monsoon season. Monk, the word for monk in Pali is bhikkhu or bhikshu in Sanskrit, and the root word it comes from the means to, these words come from means to beg. So beg, bhikkhu, it's clearly a cognate. Here's a begging bowl. It looks like a lopsided bowling ball, but actually the top comes off, so it has a cover. And here we see some monks begging.
One of the most fascinating sights in all of Luang Laos is the ceremony known as Vintabat. Every morning at dawn, hundreds of monks stream out of their respective monasteries, form a single file, and slowly walk through town in their bare feet, collecting alms from the tourists and the residents. The form of Buddhism practiced in Laos is called Theravada, and it has as its goal the release from the endless cycle of reincarnation.
So we get the idea. This really is a thing. Giving alms to monks is a basic Buddhist action. It's simple but very rich in meaning. It's an action that connects a Buddhist community. So giving food to monks accomplishes the following. It supports the monastery. It's a way to keep the monastery going. And the monks do teach the people, so this is an exchange. It accrues good karma for the donor. It allows the laity to participate in the renunciation that goes on more completely in the monastic community itself. So it sort of connects the community in that way. Giving alms is not the only thing a layperson can do to acquire merit. There is also a tradition of worship in Buddhist temples and a tradition of Buddhist pilgrimage that I alluded to earlier. Stupas are these monuments that hold relics of the Buddha's form body, little bits of ash from his cremation. Here's one. Here's another. So stupas have evolved and grown into complex temple structures. Buddhists visit these temples and make offerings to the image or the relic. Get the idea. They're very elaborate. Temple activities include chanting, praying, making offerings, and paying homage in the classic Asian pose, like this. The purpose of temple worship is not really to propitiate the Buddha. He's achieved parinirvana. Rather, it is a kind of devotional meditation that focuses the mind and orients a person on the path to nirvana. So nuns, the story of the formation of the order of nuns is strangely ambiguous. Remember, the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, was a Kshatriya Hindu, and so he was a bit patriarchal. According to traditions passed on, the Buddha had an ambivalent attitude, therefore, about the presence of women in the order. The woman that first pressed the point was Mahaprajapati Gautami, who played a special role. Notice the name Gautami, it's the feminine of Gautama. She was his aunt and his foster mother. So when his mother died, when he was 7 days old, the king's sister raised the Buddha. So she was essentially his mom. I hit images and Googled Mahaprajapati Gautami and got this picture, which is interesting because it looks like a Madonna and child, and Buddha, for some reason, is a white baby. So she was much impressed by the monastic order and approached the Buddha, asking him to ordain her and a group of her friends. He told her that would not be appropriate and sent her away. This process was repeated several times. When seen weeping outside the monastery, some monks sent for Ananda. He was the Buddha's sidekick and best friend. After speaking to Mahaprajapati, Ananda went to the Buddha and asked if he would ordain the women in a separate order of nuns. He said yes. However, he imposed some stipulations and regulations that restricted their activities. For example, a nun would always rank below the lowest monk. Still, joining an order of nuns represented a whole host of opportunities for women, and women were able to achieve awakening. That was never in question. So remember how patriarchal Hinduism traditionally was. This was a great improvement for women, just as Islam is accused of being patriarchal as well. Actually, all Homo sapiens are patriarchal, but just as Islam was a really big improvement for the state of women in pre-Islamic Arabia, Buddhism was a huge improvement for the state of women that lived in classical Hinduism. And so here we see a group of nuns today. Notice their heads are shaved too. The community of nuns that grew out of Mahaprajapati and her friends thrived in the early history of Buddhism. It was very important in the faith's dramatic expansion into other parts of Asia. Today, communities of nuns are found principally in China, Tibet, and Korea, basically in Tibetan and Mahayana Buddhism. The order of nuns has died out in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, although there are some activist wannabe nuns who have had some success in Sri Lanka and are trying in Thailand. So, tracing the history of monasticism from the Buddha's time into subsequent generations, there are several important transitions. The monks began as wanderers, but would stay in one place during the rainy season when the roads were impassable. These monsoon settlements led to permanent settlements called viharas, which are basically monasteries. After the Buddha's death, in his parinirvana, the monks faced a problem regarding authority. Where would they turn regarding disputes over discipline in the community and doctrine? So while he was still alive, the Buddha suggested that they base the authority on his own teaching. Whoever sees me sees the Dharma. Whoever sees the Dharma sees me. But how were they to understand the Dharma after the Buddha was gone? The community had to find a way to fix the Dharma so that it could function as a source of authority. So a group of senior monks convened a council to recite the Dharma, still of course oral, and establish an authoritative body of doctrine and disciplines for the monastic community that could be passed on. So they called on two people to recite directly what they'd heard from the Buddha's mouth. Ananda was called upon to recite the doctrinal teachings, the Four Noble Truths, for example. Here is Ananda teaching. And so his recitation became the Sutta Pitaka, which means basket of discourses. So Pitaka, this is Pali. Sutta is Pali for sutra, which we talked about. It's a suture. It means thread. It means discourses, discussion thread. Pitaka is a basket. So this becomes the basket of discourses, the actual theology, the Four Noble Truths. Then a man named Upali recited the Buddha's rules and regulations for managing the order. This became known as the Vinaya Pitaka, the basket of discipline. This is sort of like the rule of Benedict, Saint Benedict, who wrote the rule for how Christian monks should live. And this is the same thing. Eventually, these two were supplemented by a third basket called the Abhidhamma Pitaka, the basket of reflection. So the Sutta Pitaka and the Vinaya Pitaka, they're sort of the Torah. And the Abhidhamma Pitaka is the interpretation. It's sort of the Talmud. So these three scriptures together form the Tripitaka, or the Tripitaka, I'm not sure actually, which is the main canon for Buddhist scripture. But Buddhist scripture will explode later, and we'll talk more about that next semester. So the second, that was called the first Buddhist council when Buddha died. The second Buddhist council was called about 100 years after the Buddha's parinirvana. Historical accounts of this council are contradictory. The controversy causing the council is unclear. We just don't know a lot about this. We just kind of know it happened. And the dispute that gave rise to the Second Buddhist Council created a split in the Sangha between two parties. The first party was whatever this is, and it means doctrine of the elders. This evolved in Theravada, or Theravadan Buddhism. The second party was Mahasamgika, which means the great community, and this evolved into Mahayana Buddhism, which means the greater vehicle. Greater vehicle to where? Well, to nirvana. Superior path. So these disputes eventually gave rise to 18 philosophical schools, only one of which survives in its original form, and that is the Theravada tradition, the doctrine of the elders. More about Mahayana later.